So, Dr. Bach, how was the British Empire expanded in the 18th century?
Well, that's a big question, and
yes, very big one.
I think there are various aspects of it. I think we mentioned last time that when the Bank of England was created, one of the purposes of that was to raise money,
yes.
and I think about half the money that was raised was for the British Navy.
Yes.
And the development of the British Navy is one of the significant aspects of the 17th and 18th century. You have the Navigation Acts in the 1650s, which require British ships to be used for shipping to and from Britain. And the development of the Navy is what makes a British power worldwide a possibility. I think the other important thing in the 18th century is the other great power, the great competitor, is France. And there are repeated defeats of France, first of all in the War of the Spanish Succession, which ends with the Treaty of Utrecht.
Yes.
And at the beginning of the century, and then in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, both in India, Britain is successful, the Battle of Plassey, which enables Britain to develop her control of textile industry, and then there is the situation in Canada,
yes.
Where basically the British drive the French out of Canada.
Yes.
And then when you get right to the end of the century and into the early 19th century, there's the Napoleonic Wars and the British victory at Trafalgar in 1805 and at Waterloo in 1815. So the defeat of the French, who are the rivals for empire, is one of the most important aspects of British expansion in the 18th century. Of course, there is a great loss, and that is the American colonies, and that was a loss which the French contributed to by allying with the Americans. And in 1778, there's very significant French help to the Americans, and the man who, probably more than any other, the Earl of Chatham, William Pitt the Elder, the man who was directing British policy during the 7 Years' War, who was in some ways sympathetic to the American colonists, but who was horrified at the idea of independence, partly because this was going to be a victory for France. William Pitt actually dies in 1778 after a speech that he makes in the House of Lords, opposing American independence because of the French connection. And there are some very unpleasant aspects of what was happening as well, which is the slave trade, which Britain, I'm sorry to say, was very strongly involved with. 3.5 million slaves were transported in the 18th century. And the only good thing that I can say about it is that in 1807, slavery was abolished by the British Parliament, and Britain did that ahead of the United States.
Yes, yes. And can I say that a series of victories of Britain in the wars, overseas wars, especially against France, so gradually expanded its territory?
Yes, I mean, Britain was, for example, she got control of Gibraltar in the Treaty of Utrecht.
Yes.
The East India Company, rather than the government itself, is in control in much of India.
Yes.
Yes, there is an expansion of territory. The most important part of the territory, I think, was the Caribbean, was the West Indies, which was where this slave trade was going on.
Yes.
You know, we tend to think of the American colonies as being important. In economic terms, the Caribbean was much more important than the American colonies at the time.
Yes. Yes.
And I think also one thing that we find in the 18th century is that some thinkers are coming to think that it's not territory that's important. In fact, by the 19th century, the British government has more or less accepted that view. Adam Smith is one of those who thinks that the loss of the American colonies isn't such a big deal as long as you have free trade. And that so it's trade that really matters, not territory. And I think that's something that the British governments came to realize and to accept. And one other thing that we might just pause to reflect on is that the loss of the American colonies leads to development elsewhere. For example, a lot of criminals had been transported from Britain to the Americas, to New England. Once American independence was established, that couldn't happen, and so they were then transported to Australia, and so you get the development of Australia as a part of the British Empire from 1788 onwards. And so when Britain is blocked in by American independence, it looks elsewhere. It's not the end of empire.
Yes, yes. So you just mentioned Adam Smith said that the loss of American colonies wasn't that a big deal. But actually, seen from the 18th century, I think the loss of American colonies must have been a heavy blow to the expansion of the British Empire. So what do you think caused the revolution of the American colonies?
It's a very curious business, the American Revolution. It's not true that the King of England was a wicked dictator, nor is it true that the American colonists were being financially pressured by the British government. The British government actually withdrew the Stamp Act, which had initially tried to increase taxation on the American colonists, because the British government felt that they should pay for their policing and defence. And in fact, if you look at about 1763, the average tax paid by an American taxpayer at 1 shilling, the equivalent in Britain would be 26 shillings. And even when you get to the Boston Tea Party in 1773, when the tax on tea is the cause of the throwing the tea into Boston Harbour, the British government actually had reduced the tax on tea from 1 shilling, as 12 pence, to 3 pence. So it's not really an economic thing, I think. It's all to do with the, summed up in the slogan of Samuel Adams, no taxation without, John Adams, not Samuel Adams, John Adams, no taxation without representation. It's a political issue, I think, that the American colonists aren't represented in the Westminster Parliament, and it's that which is at the heart of it. Where do the American colonists get this insistence on their political rights from? And you have to look back to the Glorious Revolution and John Locke's second treatise on government, and the theory of popular sovereignty that are explicitly outlined there. The American colonists rebel against the British government, but they use British political theory as the basis of their rebellion.
Okay. So you think it's more of a political issue than an economic issue?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the American colonists were doing extremely well under British government, and if you were looking at it on a purely economic basis, revolution on the part of the American colonists is not what you would expect.
Yes, and these American colonies, they used the British system to rebel against the
British political philosophy. The greatest political philosopher of the day is John Locke.
Yes.
And when you read the American Declaration of Independence, you're virtually reading John Locke.
Yes, yes.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, almost the same phrase, occurs at the beginning of the second treatise in government.
Wow.
Except he includes property, it's life, liberty, property, and I think health as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bach. Thank you.